I sometimes wonder what kind of husband I'd been over the years. Not in a self-pitying way. More like the quiet question you ask yourself when you're driving home from work and the radio's off and there's nothing but highway and your own thoughts. I'm not a perfect man, I know that, but I showed up. Every day I showed up. My wife and we've been married for 11 years when things started going sideways. 11 years. Our son Theo was 9 at the time and our daughter Paige had just turned 6. We had a decent house in the suburbs of Columbus, nothing fancy but ours. I worked in logistics management, long hours but steady pay. My wife, I'll call her the way I always did at home, Honey, or later just nothing at all. She had started a part-time consulting job the year before, working with a mid-size marketing firm downtown. For the first few months of that job, she seemed energized, happy even. She'd come home talking about projects, about the team, about how good it felt to use her brain again after years of focusing on the kids. I was genuinely glad for her. I remember thinking, this is good. This is us growing. I didn't see the shift coming because I wasn't looking for it. But somewhere around month 4 or 5, something changed. She got quieter at home. Not sad quiet, more like distracted quiet. Like part of her mind was always somewhere else. I'd be talking to her at dinner and she'd nod at the right moments, but her eyes weren't quite there. I told myself it was work stress, new job pressure. I gave her space because that's what you do when you love someone. You read what they need and you give it to them without making it about yourself. The bedroom was the first real sign I couldn't explain away. We'd always had a good physical connection, even after kids, even after exhaustion, but over those months it dried up almost completely. When I brought it up gently one night, she said she was tired. When I brought it up again a few weeks later, she got a little defensive. Said I was making her feel like an obligation. That stung in a way I didn't know how to respond to, so I backed off. I started running through scenarios in my head the way you do when you're scared to look directly at the thing you're scared of. Maybe she was depressed. Maybe it was hormonal. Maybe I'd been neglecting her in ways I couldn't see. I went through all the charitable explanations and I held on to them like they were lifelines, because the alternative, the thought creeping in at 2 in the morning, was one I wasn't ready to face. I didn't have concrete evidence of anything, just a feeling. A low, steady hum of wrongness that I couldn't locate. What I did notice, small things, the kind that only add up in hindsight, was that she started being more careful with her phone. She'd always been casual about it, leaving it on the counter, charging it in the kitchen. Now it was always with her, always face down on the table. She'd step into the garage to take calls she said were work-related. Maybe they were. Probably some of them were, but something in the way she moved when her phone buzzed, a small, controlled stillness, a quick, deliberate swipe, made my stomach tighten every time I noticed it. I want to be honest here. I didn't handle this well internally. I started going over her schedule in my head, mapping her days, noting the evenings she worked late and cross-referencing them against her mood when she got home. That's not a healthy thing to do. I know that. But when you're scared and you don't know what you're scared of exactly, your brain starts trying to solve the problem even when you haven't admitted to yourself what the problem might be. Our 12th anniversary was coming up in March. I decided that was the moment. A real night out, just the two of us, something we hadn't done properly in over a year. I suggested it and she agreed quickly, which surprised me. I'd half expected resistance. We arranged for my mother to stay with the kids for the night. I made a reservation at a restaurant she'd been wanting to try, a newer Italian place on the north side that her coworkers had mentioned. Dinner was actually good. Better than I expected. We talked about the kids, about a trip we were loosely planning for summer, about an old movie we'd both loved that had come up in some algorithm. She laughed at something I said, and for a minute it felt like we were us again, the version of us from the beginning, easy and warm. I let myself relax into it. After dinner, she wanted to stop for a drink at a lounge nearby, a place with low lighting and live jazz on weekends, the kind of spot that's designed to feel intimate. Fine by me. We found a small table near the back and ordered. That's when I noticed him. A man, maybe early 40s, sat alone at the bar. Well-dressed, not in an obvious way, just one of those people who wear things well. He wasn't loud. He wasn't doing anything remarkable. But he was watching her. Not the way men sometimes glance at an attractive woman. This was different, more familiar, patient, like he was waiting for something. I watched him watch her for about 2 minutes before she glanced in his direction. Just once, briefly. And then she looked back at me and smiled, then asked me something about whether I wanted to share the cheese plate. I answered, but I kept my eyes on her face and I saw it. That slight, controlled effort not to look at him again. The kind of effort you only make when looking would mean something. I said nothing. I sat with it. We finished our drinks and I suggested we get the check. In the car on the way home, she was talking. Something about Paige's recital, something about a scheduling conflict at school. And I was responding at the right intervals, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. Sitting with that look. That one careful non-look. I didn't say anything that night, or the next day. I went back to my regular routine and tried to reason with myself. I had seen a man look at my wife, and my wife not look back. That was it. That was the sum of the evidence. I was building a case out of paranoia. I almost convinced myself. But I couldn't let it go completely. So I did something I'm not especially proud of. I hired a private investigator. I found one through a referral from a buddy of mine who'd used someone during a business dispute. Licensed, discreet, professional. I called them on a Tuesday while I was parked outside a Walgreens and explained the situation in the vaguest terms possible. He'd heard it before. He didn't make me feel judged. We agreed on a 2-week engagement. Those 2 weeks were genuinely one of the harder periods of my life. Not because anything dramatic was happening. It was the opposite of dramatic. I went to work. I came home. I helped Theo with his science project. I watched Paige's recital and filmed the whole thing on my phone. I smiled and laughed and functioned completely normally, while underneath all of it, this quiet dread sat in my chest like a stone. I called the investigator 4 times during those 2 weeks. Each time he told me there was nothing conclusive yet. I told myself that was good news. I told myself a lot of things. When he finally asked me to come in, I drove to his office on a Thursday afternoon telling myself I was ready for whatever was in the envelope he'd placed on the desk between us. I wasn't. He walked me through it methodically. 2 weeks of surveillance, followed her on 9 separate occasions, reviewed her communications as far as he was legally able. What he found was not nothing, but it wasn't what I'd feared either. There had been lunches. 4 of them over the course of the 2 weeks, with a man from her firm. Not a direct colleague, more of an external consultant who worked with their team regularly. The lunches were at restaurants. Not hidden, not hotels, not anywhere that required concealment. Just lunches. He'd seen them laughing. He'd seen him touch her arm once, briefly, the way people do in conversation. He'd seen nothing physical beyond that. No kissing. No embraces. Nothing that crossed a line you could point to on a map. He also told me that the man I'd seen at the lounge that night, yes, he'd been able to identify him through her firm's public directory, was the same person. He was not nobody to her. He was not a stranger whose gaze she'd met by accident. I thanked the investigator. I drove home. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. That was 3 years ago. I'm going to tell you what happened after, but I want to tell it honestly, which means I have to tell you what I chose not to do first. I chose not to confront her that night. I chose not to blow up our family on the basis of 4 lunches and 1 careful glance. I wasn't being weak. I was being deliberate. There's a difference, though I understand if that's hard to see from the outside. I told her we needed to talk. That weekend, after the kids were in bed, I said I'd been feeling disconnected from her for months, and that I needed her to be honest with me about what was going on. I didn't mention the PI. I didn't mention the lunches. I just opened the door. What she did next, I think about it still. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought she was going to give me the polished version, the safe version, the everything's fine version. But she didn't. She told me she had developed feelings for someone at work. She said it hadn't been physical. She said that from the moment those feelings became real to her, she had been trying to figure out what to do with them, and that she had been handling it badly, and that she knew it, and that she was sorry. She told me she hadn't acted on it. She told me she didn't want to lose us. She was crying by the end. I wasn't. I was just sitting there feeling something I can only describe as the strange calm that comes after a long period of bracing for impact. I asked her about the lunches. Her face changed. Not guilty exactly, more like cornered. She confirmed them. She said they had talked about it, about the feelings, and that she had ended it, or was in the process of ending it. That the last lunch had been that. I told her I needed some time. Not weeks, just a few days. I stayed at my brother's place in Hilliard. I told the kids it was a work trip. I don't know if they believed me. Those 3 days were the clearest thinking I've done in a long time. I went through it all. The anger, which was real and valid and needed to be felt. The hurt, which went deeper than the anger. The fear about the kids, about the house, about what restructuring 11 years looks like in practice. And then, underneath all of that, something quieter. The memory of who she was before this. The woman who drove 6 hours in a snowstorm to be at my father's funeral, who learned to make my grandmother's soup recipe because I'd mentioned missing it once, who had been, for most of our marriage, a genuinely good partner. People are complicated. That's not an excuse. But it's true. I came home on the third day. We sat down and we talked for a long time. The kind of talk that doesn't have a neat resolution, that just keeps going until there's nothing left unsaid. I told her the hurt was real. I told her the trust was damaged. I told her I was willing to try, but that trying meant honesty. Complete, ongoing, no more careful distance, and that the moment she couldn't give me that, we were done. She agreed. She ended contact with him entirely. She changed firms 3 months later, which I didn't ask her to do, but which she said felt necessary for herself. We started seeing a couples therapist, a practical, no-nonsense woman named Dr. Harriet, who didn't let either of us hide behind vague language. It was uncomfortable in a productive way. That was 3 years ago. I said that already, but it bears repeating because sometimes I need to remind myself how much distance we've put between then and now. Our life today is not perfect, but it's real. She knows I know the whole truth now. I told her about the PI eventually, about a year into therapy. She was upset at first, then she understood. Or she said she did. Maybe both are true at once. We've gotten better at holding complicated things at the same time, the two of us. Theo turned 12 last fall and started playing travel baseball, which means our weekends are now organized entirely around a 9-year-old's pitching schedule. I mean a 12-year-old, sorry. He keeps aging. Paige has discovered an absolute obsession with marine biology and has informed us she will be living on a research vessel by the time she's 30, which, honestly, I believe. Our house is the same house. Our cars are older. I'm not telling this story because I figured out the right answer. I'm telling it because last spring, my wife came home from lunch looking quieter than usual. Not the old quiet. A different kind. She sat down at the kitchen table and I poured her a cup of coffee and she told me about her friend. I'll call her college roommate because that's what she was. Her college roommate had called her that afternoon to share, excitedly, that she'd been seeing someone on the side. Married man, she was also married. Both of them in long-term relationships. She was calling because she was happy. She wanted someone to be happy with her. My wife said she'd listened to the whole thing and then she'd asked her college roommate, gently but directly, if she remembered the year things fell apart between us. Her friend said she did. She'd never been told the full story, but she'd seen how hard those months were. My wife said, "I'm going to tell you what happened, and I want you to hear it before you make a decision you can't undo." She told her everything. The consultant, the lunches, what it felt like when I came home from my brother's place and sat down across from her and she didn't know which version of that conversation she was walking into. What 3 years of rebuilding actually looks like from the inside. Not a movie montage, not a clean arc, just slow, unglamorous, necessary work. Her friend was quiet for a long time on the phone. Then she said, "I didn't realize. My wife came home and told me all of this, and I sat across from her at our kitchen table in the late afternoon light, and I thought, there it is. That's the whole story. Not the affair that wasn't. Not the PI report. Not the 3 days in Hilliard. The whole story is this woman sitting across from me who chose honesty when she could have chosen easier things, and who used the worst thing she almost did to stop someone else from doing it." That night, after the kids were in bed, we sat on the back porch for a while. The neighborhood was quiet except for somebody a few streets over playing music too loud, the way people do on warm Friday evenings when they've had a decent week. She leaned her head against my shoulder. I put my arm around her. I still think about that man at the bar sometimes, the patient way he looked at her. I think about what the investigator told me, and I think about all the things that didn't happen. The full version of the disaster that got stopped at the door. I don't know if I'm grateful exactly. I don't know what the right word is. What I know is that I'm still here. She's still here. And on most evenings, when I come home from work and the kitchen smells like something's been cooking too long, and Paige is asking me 17 questions before I put down my bag and Theo is somewhere upstairs with his headphones on most evenings, that feels like enough. More than enough. It's not a story about revenge. It's not a story about being right. It's a story about what you choose when you finally know everything, and whether you can live with that choice in the long run. 3 years in, I think I can. I think we both can. I've thought a lot about what actually saved my marriage. Not the PI report. Not the 3 days at my brother's place in Hilliard. Not even the therapy sessions with Dr. Harriet, as useful as those were. What saved it was a series of choices, small, unglamorous, often uncomfortable choices, made by two people who were both tired and scared and still decided to keep choosing each other anyway. That's not romantic in the way movies want it to be. There's no single moment I can point to and say, that's when it turned. It was more like a slow accumulation of honest conversations that didn't go anywhere neat. Of nights where we sat in the same room and acknowledged the distance between us without pretending it wasn't there. That takes a particular kind of stubbornness. Not the angry kind. The patient kind. Here's what I know about cause and effect. At least the version I've lived. The distance that nearly broke us didn't come from nowhere. It grew in the silence we both let sit too long. I told myself I was giving her space. Maybe I was. But I was also avoiding the harder conversation, the one where I admitted I was scared and needed her to meet me where I was. That silence had a cost. Not a punishment handed down by the universe. Just a natural consequence of two people not talking until the gap gets wide enough for something else to move in. And she made her own choices in that silence. Ones she's had to sit with, the lunches, the feelings she let develop instead of naming them to me first. She knows that. She said it plainly, more than once, without me prompting her. That kind of honesty, the kind you offer when no one's forcing you to, is the only kind that actually means anything. What I've learned about intelligence in all this isn't the book kind. It's the kind that asks, what is actually happening here, underneath what I can see? When I noticed the phone going face down on the table, the smarter move wasn't to ignore it or to immediately explode. It was to sit with the discomfort long enough to understand what I needed to know and then find out. The PI wasn't paranoia. It was me deciding that I deserved clarity before I made any decisions about my own life. That's not weakness. That's someone taking themselves seriously. And the grit part, the part that doesn't get talked about enough, is what comes after you know. Anyone can react to a crisis. The harder thing is deciding, calmly and deliberately, what you actually want your life to look like on the other side of it. I wanted my kids to grow up in a home where people worked through hard things. I wanted to find out if the woman I'd married was still in there, under all the distance and the mistakes. Turns out she was. But I only found that out because I was willing to stay in the room long enough to look. My wife used our worst year to stop her college roommate from walking into one of her own. That's what I keep coming back to. The thing that almost destroyed us ended up being something she could hand to someone else, like a warning light. That only happens when people are honest about what they went through instead of burying it. Theo and Paige will never know this story, not for a long time. But they're growing up watching two people who chose the harder, more honest path. I have to believe that counts for something. It's not a neat story. It doesn't end with anyone winning. It ends with two people sitting on a porch on a Friday night, a little older, a little less certain about everything, and still there. Still choosing. That's the whole thing, really. You just keep choosing.